Good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Gotthard, and I'm the Executive Director of the Huntington Historical Society. And the Society was founded in 1903, and we work to preserve and share the history of the town of Huntington. I wanted, if we could show the sponsor slide, Robert. I wanted to thank our sponsors of today's program, M&T Bank. We've been very fortunate to have M&T support for a number of years under their former title of People United Bank, and they are here for your banking needs and happy to assist you with branches all throughout the area. I also wanted to thank our members, people who are annually support the society for their contributions and attendance at our programs. We have at the end, Robert will show you what we have going right now at the society. Very important that we introduce our esteemed speakers today. We have Robert Hughes, who is the town historian. As town historian, he serves also to secretary to the Huntington Historic Preservation Commission and the African American Historic Designation Council. He works with heritage organizations in the town to assist them in achieving their missions of preserving and sharing Huntington's history. Robert is also an author of two books, Cold Spring Harbor, and also the co-author of Northport as part of the Acadia Publishing's Images of America series. He's written numerous articles about various aspects of Huntington's history, published at huntingtonhistory.com. Mr. Hughes also produced a video, The History of Huntington, as a part of the town's 350th anniversary celebration in 2003, and that you can find on YouTube. It's a great video. I've seen it number of times. Our other speaker today is Robert Toby Kissam. He's a retired high school mathematics teacher who for most of his adult life has been involved with local history. Mr. Kissam was a founding member and past president of the Green Lawn Centerport Historical Association, where he is co-chair of the committee to preserve the historic 1730 Sudam House. More recently, has served several terms on the Board of Trustees with the Historical Society, serving as president of the board for 2 years. Toby is co-chair of the committee for the Trade School Restoration and Expansion Project that was completed in 2016. He is currently serving as Collections Committee of the Preservation Long Island and serves as treasurer. And he's a board member of the Old Huntington Green, Inc. Mr. Kissam is on the board of the Van Wyck Lefferts Tide Mill, Inc. And he is a member of the Town of Huntington Preservation Commission. Besides giving talks on various topics of Huntington history, Mr. Kissam has published an article in Ceramics in America on a Huntington pottery, and edited a book on Walt Whitman and its historical connections to Huntington. And he writes a monthly article in the Huntington Bay Stroll. And today they'll be reprising their presentation on the historic houses of West Neck. So without further ado, I will turn the presentation over to Robert and Toby. And thank you again for attending today's program.
All right, thank you all for attending. As Stephanie said, we're going to be talking about the historic houses in the West Neck area, mostly along West Neck Road, but a few other outlying areas as well. Toby writes for Stroll Huntington Bay, regular monthly column for that magazine. And he also has written for Stroll Lloyd Harbor, and part of that research, I think, led him to some of the Sammis properties we're going to be talking about today. So we call this Sammisville. That's never really been an area called Sammisville. It's something we've made up for the purposes of this talk. But the Sammis family connection to the area goes back to 1660 and continues, into the 20th century certainly. But we're ending in 1936, which is the house in the lower right that we will get to later on. Just by way of background, my slides do not want to go. Here we go. We can see the early 1858 map shows all the Sammis names. Toby, do you want to talk about these names?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've always known these houses existed. In fact, 70 years ago, the Historical Society would run tours up and down West Neck Road to all the historic houses. And, they named a number of them and a lot of Sammises in the names, but it wasn't until we really looked at this map, found these 10 Sammis families. The one at the bottom of the map is Widow Sammis, is where John Dave's Lane are. For those in Huntington will know that. And then the road off to the right, kind of at the top, is School Lane. And so these houses all exist in about a 1.5-mile stretch of West Neck Road in Lloyd Harbor. And so we totaled up and counted 10 Sammis houses on this map. And then we went to see how many of them still existed. And we found 9 of them. And we said, wow, this is, putting 2 and 2 together in the Sammis families. Then we began to look at, as you'll see, the relationship between all these Sammis houses and families, and found that they were very related. And that's basically what we've tried to do in this this talk, is to show how the relationship of the early owners, the early Sammis owners of these houses, to each other, and kind of build some family trees. It may get a little confusing, but bear with us, and you're welcome to answer some questions. Before we leave this map, we wanted to point out a few things on it that are going to come back up. And you see at the top C.C. Camerling and the observatory that's mentioned here on this 1858 map. You'll see A.B. Crossman, who had the big brickyard, the Crossman family, Gilbert Crossman. There were a number of, at the top you can see where the Crossman brickyards were there on Lloyd Harbor itself. The Van Wyck grist mill will come up, and that's over there in Lloyd Harbor. And that plays an important part of the story. In the Admiral Paulding, the Commodore Paulding, as he's called on this map, he didn't reach Admiral until after the Civil War. And then this map also shows the earliest location of the Catholic Church in Huntington, which was down on what today is called Huntington Road, and it's where the Catholic cemetery is today. And then the other name that we mentioned is Brush, up there, right near a little north of the Sammis family, because that's where the original Brush homesteads were. So we can go to the next map, I guess. Okay, and so when we discovered all these, we kind of said, okay, what part of Lloyd Harbor did the Sammises own at one point? And we came up with about 1,000 acres of land, which is kind of outlined in red there. North of that, or northwest of that, is where the Brush original homestead were. The Crossman there you can see are labeled. The Rogers, which preceded the Van Wycks, around the mill was where an original Rogers family settlement was. And then the original settlement of the Conklins were along the west side of Huntington Harbor. And we show that. But in between there and surrounded by all those other people is where the houses and the land that the Sammises owned.
And it's not necessarily that they owned these 1,000 acres at any one time. It was over the course of centuries they bought and sold land, and we think in totality they owned about 1,000 acres. And it's hard to determine exactly where each piece of land they owned was, because sometimes the chestnut tree in one corner died, the pile of stones in the other corner somebody moved, and so there's no way to figure out exactly where the property started and ended until we get into more of the 19th and 20th century, where it's a little easier to figure out. And it's also interesting, we've come across some records that after the American Revolution, when a lot of the Loyalist lands were seized, there were lawsuits back and forth. And Alexander Hamilton, ironically, represented Loyalists in many cases, and Aaron Burr was on the other side of some of those legal cases. And Aaron Burr represented the Lloyd family trying to recover land. And Burr and Joseph Lloyd ended up buying land on West Neck Road, somewhere in the middle of this Sammisville. But again, we don't know exactly where that would have been.
It was somehow related to the Conklins, wasn't it? So it would have been down toward the south, of that. And the answer to the question that was just asked on the chat room, yes, that is where West Neck Beach is where the Crossman Brickyards were. Okay, and so one of the ways that we've been able to track that they own the land at some point is when by buying land. And these records from the Huntington Town records gave us some idea of what they were, what lands they were buying and purchasing from certain people. And the earliest that we found John Sammis purchasing is in 1663. Now he was born in, he was born in 42, I think, 1642 in Connecticut. He had a sister, Joanna, that was a little bit younger than he was. His father died in 1650 when he would have been still very young. And at some point he made his way to Southold, but the mother remarried and never came with John and his sister Joanna. So we're still trying to figure out exactly how that, they wouldn't have, as young children, how they got across and traveled to Long Island, first to Southold, and then to Huntington. But the earliest purchase of land for John Sammis is 1663. And then he went on and he purchased other lands, some of which, we can figure out where it was, and others of it we can't. But at least we know they purchased a lot of land. And Joanna, his sister, ended up marrying, I think it was Richard Brush, and Richard and Thomas Brush also came from Connecticut, Massachusetts to Southold, and then to Huntington at that same period of time.
Another way that we can trace some of the land is subsequent or later sales. So this is Chamberlain, who we mentioned before, who was a congressman and minister to Russia, and with Andrew Jackson, the founder of the modern Democratic Party. He ended up coming to settle in West Neck, which is now Lloyd Harbor. And here's the deed from John Sammis, a later John Sammis, to Chamberlain in 1842. So we know that John Sammis had that land, and on the maps, it's pretty clearly identified where Chamberlain's property was. So that's another way to trace the total ownership of land by the Sammis family. And this is the observatory we pointed out on the map in 1858. There it is on the right. There is a large bluff in that area overlooking the harbor, but probably not as dramatic as this picture makes it seem.
And this is an aerial view that shows the Van Wyck Lefferts Tide Mill that we know was built in 1794. But when the permission to dam a tide mill actually captures the tide in a mill pond, and then holds that water until it's ready to flow over the wheel. And you can see kind of in the middle of that, the tide gates where the water is allowed in, and then the mill itself is off to the left, where there would be a water wheel that would be invisible because it's on the other side of the building. And so when the miller was beginning operations, he would open up the sluice gates and allow the water from the pond to come out. We know that they got permission to build this in 1793, but we also know that John Sammis had a previous grist mill on his property, and his house still stands, as we're going to see later on. And I don't identify it, but if we take the lower angle, the line, it's off the picture. It's in that little cove to the left of the mill pond. But land of John Sammis is clearly visible on this 1836 map still, owning all that. And the big white house that isn't identified, that was the miller's house. But this talk isn't about the mill, it's about the Sammis family. So we will go
Stay on topic. We could get off topic and talk about all sorts of things. Now, this gets very confusing, and this is a partial family tree of the Sammis family. And what the intent is here is to show that the relationship among all the houses. So the houses that we're talking about are all on the top and color-coded to the tree so that you can see which branch of the family belonged to which house. And we're going to break this down as we go through, so don't try to absorb this at all now, because it's going to be virtually impossible. But we see at the top John Sammis, the migrant who came to Huntington in 1660s and lived in the original homestead on South Down Road. And here's that house passing down from generation to generation of Johns and Jonas and Sammis. And the John Sammis over here is the one who sold land to Chamberlain, part of the property, not the house itself. And then as we see that the John Sammis's son Silas built the house at 302 West Neck, the blue house on here marked as blue. And that's the house on the corner of West Neck and John Daves Lane. And you can see that this passed down through his family for several generations. And then one of his other children, Jesse, built the house at what's this color?
It's black. It's 302.
Black one. And that passed down to his son Epinetus, and etc. all through. I think it's probably better if we just get right into all the slides on the individual branches rather than try to go through too much of it right here. And this basically shows the same thing, but with photos of the house and the maps. These are the houses that were on that family tree chart. And you can see they're spread up mostly up along West Neck Road, a couple over on South Down as well. And
now let's go back to that slide for a second, because I mean, that shows that we found 16 houses that still stand. Not all of them are in West Neck. And so we're not going to we'll talk about all of them, but we'll tie it in more to the family with the houses that are on West Neck. And I've put little stars on them to show that the houses that still stand are the red ones. The one house that was missing from that's no longer, that was on the 1858 map, no longer, is that green star one. And then the two blue stars up at the top, they are kind of outbuildings or other buildings that still stand. We've had them on house tours actually, and we've been able to tie them into the Sammis family as well, but they weren't on that last family tree.
So here's the family tree of houses, and you see the John Sammis house here on Southdown. We're saying 1665, and then his sons built these houses, and his son built these houses, and this house eventually became descendant, built this house, and as you see, going all the way through. So we have centuries and generations of houses from 1665 up to 1936.
In the arrow, the red arrow with the heart in it indicates that children of the two houses that the arrows point to married each other. They were second cousin Sammises, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but they ended up living in the house on the left, continuing generations later.
Okay, so this is the John Sammis house as it exists today. It's obviously been expanded and modernized over the centuries, but within the core of this house is John Sammis's house, built around 1665. And this is, if you were coming down Mill Lane from West Neck Road and kept going straight, you'd be right in the driveway of this house as you cross South Down.
And Mill Lane would have gotten its name, possibly from the mill that still stands on the mill pond or in the mill dam, or it could have gotten its name because this is where John Sammis would have had an original grist mill that would have been stream fed from above water would come down the hill that Mill Road it shows from the mountains up there, from the elevations up there. Okay, and this shows the Sammis, the genealogy of the Sammis family that lived in this house. They lived in it until about 18 the 1880s, I think, when this John Sammis ended up selling it to
And Choice.
sorry, to the Van Schoik family, who had bought the Camberling property. And he added, Van Schoik added a bunch of, he added to the property that the Camberlings owned when he assumed that property in 1860. And you can see the other thing that this shows is the relationship between Richard Sammis and his daughter Joanna marrying into the Brush family, and the other Brush married a daughter of the original settler John Conklin, and they settled, as I said, as we saw, on the west shore of the harbor. And that Thomas married into the Wicks family, who married back in, that Brush married into John Sammis II, and so forth and so on.
Everybody gets related eventually.
That's true.
They all came together from Connecticut and Southhold to Huntington and ended up intermarrying in the early years.
All right, this kind of tries to show that actually we think it's probably the grandsons, the third generation, John Sammis II, lived in, we know he lived in the original homestead, and one of his sons, well, two of his sons actually, one was Sylvanus and the other one was Silas I, and they built two houses. The house on the left is on Southdown Road, and we actually saw that on one of the maps earlier, and the house on the right is down on John Daves Lane. I know, and these what we call third generation Sammis houses. And these show the same two houses, and they just show how they got to them. You know, how Sylvanus descends from the original John, and how Silas II. Now, we're not sure that it was Silas II that built it. It could have been Silas I. We don't know where he would have, we don't have a place where he would have lived. He may have lived with his brother in the original homestead, or he may have built the house on John Daves Lane.
John Daves. Yeah, fun fact about Silas Sammis I, who died in 1723, the oldest marked grave in the old burying ground is for that Silas Sammis.
And there's also indication that they were members of the Old First Church. I think Silas and John and their wives are listed as early congregants of the Old First Church.
So this is showing that Sylvanus Sammis house on Southdown Road. So the original homestead on this 1909 map is now Van Schoik, but right around the corner, it was eventually William and Watt Sammis, who were right here. Watts Rose Sammis and William Smith Sammis co-owned that house in 1909. And the farmhouse, which we believe was a Sammis property on the Chamberlain property, is over here. And Wisteria Cottage, which we'll talk about, which probably started as a Sammis barn, is over here on Southdown Road, or just off Southdown Road today.
Yeah, this talks about the farmhouse at the top on the right, or in the middle top. And that we know was sold by that John Sammis in 1842 to Camberlin, that property. This house would have been on that property. We don't know which Sammis would have lived in that house at the time, because the John, who we believe sold all that, owned all that land, lived in the original homestead. But that still stands, and it was on one of our earlier house tours. The picture below that is a house that's on the extension, well, just past where Southdown Road turns to the right there. And it's built kind of so you can enter it into a hill, so you can enter it from above onto the second floor or around back onto the first floor. And it has a big heavy rubble foundation. And we believe it was not built as a house, but as the barn where you could let your livestock in from the fields down below, and you'd have your hay and so forth stored above it. We know that when Admiral Paulding owned his estate, there is shown on that map, he built that, he changed that into a living structure for his guests, and he called that Wisteria Cottage. And it still stands today, and may be as early as the original homestead structure. A couple of other things on this map is that in that white box is the land that the Van Schoiks bought in the 1880s that added to the original Camberling property. I guess that's about all that we have to say about this.
Now we move into the fourth generation. So this is still the house on John Daves Lane, 302 West Neck. And you see it passes from Silas II down to Silas III, to David Sammis, to Luther C. Sammis, who is the father of David and John. And that's where we get John Daves Lane from those two brothers. And this picture, I guess, is Silas the third, who, that can't be him. What is this picture?
No, it's not.
No.
It's the Silas III's house. It's the house. It's the same picture.
Right.
Yeah.
But this picture is obviously not from 1803.
No.
And then Silas II's sons, who didn't inherit the house, Jesse and Alexander, have two salt box houses that we'll talk about a little bit later on. Just going back to Luther, who was at 302 West Neck. He is recorded in the receipt book of Daniel Sammis, who had a sawmill. We'll see a picture of that. It was in Huntington Village. And he was the first cousin once removed and brother-in-law, Luther and Daniel. So they were cousins and also brothers-in-law because
David's sister married David's sister's Elizabeth
Sammis. So it gets very confused. They're all very well intermarried. But you just see the connection of the family from this early commercial enterprise in Huntington. And this is the sawmill. It was a windmill in the village. And you see all the logs out front ready for milling. And it was powered by that windmill, which is horizontal rather than vertical. And those sails were about 6 feet tall. And school kids used to ride up there and take rides around like on a merry-go-round. Probably not very safe, but no reports of any damage to children. But the weather vane up at the top, this eagle, did suffer some damage. Here's another view coming down Main Street from Woolsey, more or less in that area, coming around the corner. Here is the sawmill. They said it was the most conspicuous building in the place, and you can see why. It's quite large. Here's Old First Church over here. This would be the old burying ground, and across the street, which is now the DAR chapter house, as originally the Universalist Church in Huntington, and this is going down Main Street.
I mean, you can see the early academy up across from the church.
Yes, the academy building here, which is where town hall is today. And that weather vane, when the mill blew over in 1869 during a storm, the weather vane broke and part of the wing broke off, but somebody saved it, donated it to the Huntington Historical Society. And now you can see the logo is based on that. And the mill originally stood on the hill sort of north of the post office, the current location of the post office. It seems it may have been too windy up there, so they moved it down in front of where the post office is. So more or less between Rose's Pizza and the post office in that area on just west of Clinton Place.
Yeah, when they built the new post office in the 50s, right? 50s? 60s. They had to dig out some of that hill to give them a flat area. And where the parking lot is today, there were houses and streets in between there. That's all been removed by now, but that's essentially where the location of the mill was.
Okay, now we're going to talk about in the fourth generation still, the other salt box houses. Silas III inherited the house on John Dave's, and his brothers, one Sammis, Jesse Sammis, acquired this house at 392, which is, if you're familiar with West Neck Road, as you're going up, it's on the right-hand side next to the pond. There's a pond over here, and it always has this beautiful wisteria growing around the front door. And the other brother, Alexander, acquired this house, which is at 415 West Neck Road. It's behind a stone wall, and it's before you get up to the seminary on the left-hand side. Interestingly, they all face south. Even the Jesse Sammis house, even though it faces West Neck Road, at that point, West Neck Road is east-west, so the house is facing south. And when we were told that, I didn't believe it. I had to take out my phone with a compass app and see if it was true. And it absolutely is. It is true. And that was because they would get more sunlight into the house by facing south. The Alexander Sammis house, this salt box, was probably built by the Gould family. He married Amy Gould in 1782. And it was probably previously in the Gould family. So he didn't build it, he just acquired it. And probably also true with Jesse Sammis. That house pre-existed his ownership of it.
In fact, we have a deed of the sale when Jesse bought it from what the Lefferts family. Yeah,
It's Adam Lefferts.
yeah.
So this is sort of showing you the same thing again. The three brothers, and here's the Adam Lefferts conveying this property in 1791. This is inside the Jesse Sammis house. Photograph taken years ago. And so it's currently been renovated. And if you follow Instagram, you can follow the old salt box, and they document their work in renovating the house. And one of the projects they did that we got to see on the house tour last year is this cute little Harry Potter bathroom under the staircase.
You notice the hand-hewn beam there sits there right across from the throne.
And this is the pond that I mentioned. So this is the view from the north across the pond to the back of the house. And in the earlier deeds, this area was referred to as a very swampy area. So obviously somebody built up the land around it to create a pond out of that mushy, swampy area next to the house.
And this is where the water or the streams started from that ran down Mill Road eventually and fed that original John Sammis grist mill down at the foot of Mill Road.
So this
Okay,
is,
well, go ahead.
this is the what would have been the Gould house, and then became a Sammis house after the marriage of Alexander to Amy Gould. And you see it here on the 1873 map. The Crossman family had acquired the house by then. There's a couple of interesting stories from the Revolution, which we're not, the Sammis family likes to talk about them, but the Sammis family actually didn't own this house until the very end of the Revolution, because they didn't, Alexander and Amy didn't get married until 1782. So it may have still been a Gould house, but they talk about the British who had a fort up on Lloyd Neck called Fort Franklin, needed a tailor to mend their uniforms. And they didn't have one at the fort, so they commandeered a room in this house and used it for the tailor's office. And also that the Sammis family were very upset about the British occupation of Huntington. And so when the British were riding their horses back up to Lloyd Neck after being in the village, they would string a rope across West Neck Road and trip up the horses, maybe take some pot shots at the soldiers. Hard to say whether those stories are true or not, but they are family lore that's been passed down from generation to generation, and it's been located to this house. Whether that's true or not, we're not sure.
And if you look up at the family trees, you can see Rebecca Conklin married Ebenezer Gould, who we believe came from Connecticut and built that house at some point. And you can also see that Alexander Sammis II marries into the Brush family, and one of their children was George Brush Sammis. It gets very confusing sometimes when you try to look at these, but knowing the genealogy and the relationship of the families helps us piece together some of these stories.
Toby is the real family tree expert. And he has looked into the Crossmans. The Crossmans from the Brickyards related to the Crossmans on Crossman Place by Main Street Nursery. Do we know?
Oh yeah, definitely. Crossman Place. Yeah, that's where one of the, I forget now, one of them built a house that still stands there. It used to be on Woolsey, but then they built a house in front of it. And so now its address is Crossman Place, but it still faces Woolsey. So it's still facing south. And definitely that's one of the descendants of the original Crossman brothers who ran the Brickyards. Now, this is a story that we had always heard and knew it was going to be true because nobody would have lied about it. But and there was evidence that it was true about the property on Banbury Lane, an estate that was built in 1936, and you can see from the map, a later map, where it sits down there overlooking Cold Spring Harbor, and it was bought by a descendant of the Sammis family, but we had trouble connecting it. It eventually was donated to the laboratory, Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, and is now part of their, I guess it's a separate campus, where the Robertson, what they call the Robertson House, and the Robertson Center, I guess, or Banbury Center. Robert, you mean, but we had trouble finding the descendancy from Alexander, who owned the house that we've just been talking about, to the Robertson. We knew Robertson's mother was a Sammis, but we weren't sure what her ancestry was. And Robert, you can tell the story about how you were looking for something else and found the obituary.
As always happens, you look for something else, you find something you're not looking for that's very useful. It's always good if you know that it's useful. And in this case, we did, because we were doing the research on all the Sammises. And as Toby said, we knew the Robertsons were Sammises, and the story was that they came back to buy the ancestral land. And it turns out his mother was Anna. And I found her obituary without looking for it. And there it was, and it made the connection, and we could trace from her back to Alexander. And I don't know if we explained this.
Yeah, we do that in the next, this is the next slide.
Yeah, so it's Alexander who married Amy Gould at the top, and all the way through all these Sammises. Anna Sammis is the daughter of Joseph Sammis. Her mother died when she was 8 years old.
7 or 8, one of the two, yeah.
No, not her mother. Her father died when she was 8 years old, right? No, the mother.
The mother died, right.
Mother died.
Anna was born, yeah, when she was 7 years old, the mother died. And then the father remarried. And then when she was 13 years old, her father died. And so she was raised by her stepmother, and the stepmother had moved back into Brooklyn in the Queens area where she met Charles Lowry Robertson. And it was their son, Charles S. Robertson, who had, well, go ahead, you can tell the story, Robert.
Well, he ended up marrying Maria Hartford Hoffman.
Now, he was successful on his own, somewhat.
But she was more successful because she inherited the A&P grocery store fortune. And shortly after they got married, he came back to Huntington and purchased up, his mother's family's old property off of West Neck Road. He was a philanthropist, an investment banker, graduated from Princeton University, big supporter of Princeton, established the Robertson Foundation in 1961 to endow the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. And then after his wife died in the 70s, he deeded the home in Lloyd Harbor to the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. And the labs now uses it as a place for seminars. They have regular seminars all the time. And the scientists stay in the mansion and in also this newer building, Sammis Hall, and they discuss all sorts of interesting topics that would probably bore us to tears, but a lot of Nobel Prizes have come out of some of those seminars. A lot of Nobel Prize winners come to Cold Spring Harbor Laboratories and stay at the Banbury Center and make all sorts of wonderful discoveries. All right, now we'll move on to, I guess, Jesse.
The children of Jesse, right. Epineus was one son, and he kept the Jesse's house there at 392, and his other son was Richard Sammis the first, because there'd be other Richard Sammises to follow, and he ended up building the house at the opposite the police booth on south of Mill Road on West Neck. That's kind of hidden behind the hedges, but it's a beautiful 5-bay colonial house that would have been built at about the time Richard I married Phoebe Ketchum in 1800.
So here
yeah, go ahead. It's very difficult to take this picture without by peeking in off the road. This is a picture of the house the way it looked today. Before I had met the people that lived there, I've since met them, and so I've been actually in the house. But you can't see the entire house here, but you can see on the 1917 map, you see Theodore Sammis is the descendant that ends up being the last Sammis owner of that house. And at the edge of the walk, there are in the last slab, there are the initials TPS, I think, and the current owners didn't know. TPS, and the current owners didn't know what that would have been, but of course it was for Theodore P. Sammis, who lived in that house and died in 1946. You may want to tell us.
Yeah, his father Edgar had been in the house, and Edgar's brother Charles inherited land over on Southdown Road next to it. But Charles lived on Wolsey Street, closer to the village. He built the house down there instead. And he married a much younger woman in 1911.
As his second
wife. Died shortly thereafter.
Yeah, right.
No connection, I'm sure. Now, this is a sketch of the same house.
And this shows the whole house as the 5-bay colonial, which comes back into our story in a few minutes.
Now, we talked about Jesse's son Epinetus, who lived in the salt box at 392. It's a little salt box next to the pond. He purchased large amounts of land, totaling about 272 acres over the years in this area, including from Conklin Gould, who was a relative from the marriage of Amy Gould and Alexander Sammis. Amy Sammis is, of course, Alexander's widow, and Charles Kelsey also had land up there that he purchased. So he put together large holdings of land that were later developed by his descendants. And this family tree looks kind of confusing, so maybe Toby can help me.
Well, there's Ebenezer Gould, who we believe built the house on the left, and his son was Conklin Gould. His daughter was Amy Gould, and of course, Amy married a Sammis, so that's where you get the Amy Sammis in that chart on the left. But it's Epineus, who we've highlighted in the middle there, that his 3 sons built houses across, he built houses across West Neck Road on the opposite side of West Neck Road that his father, that their father Epineus had accumulated over the years. And those are the houses that come up next.
Right, so Epinetus is purchasing land from his aunt Amy and his cousin Charles, and also Conklin Gould, who was not only related on the the Gould Sammis side, but over here from David Sammis over this way, and then Luther
His
Sammis.
wife was the Sammis, right?
So we get to the 6th generation,
And
Epaenetus.
yeah, go ahead. You want to do this?
They build these houses. So go ahead.
Yeah, these are the 3 sons of Epaenetus building houses across the street. And all 3 of these houses are the ones still stand. The only one that looks like somewhat like the way it would have been built is the house on the right, which was probably originally a Long Island half house, which instead of being that 5-bay colonial that we saw in Richard's house, would have been more like the Kissam house is, with 3 bays, the center, and then a utility wing on the right, being the other 2 bays. We'll see examples of that. But we believe that the 2 houses on the left, which are very ornate and very Victorian, one still looks the way it does in this picture. The other one changed again, as we'll see, the Jesse Fleet house, the one in the middle. But we feel they all look somewhat like the house on the right when they were originally built. And the 3 sons, of course, were Louis Sammis, Jesse Fleet Sammis, and Elbert Sammis. Interesting enough, I think, though it's not that important, but Richard II, who inherited the house down by the police booth, married, his first wife was the daughter of Epaenetus. So there are actually 4 from that family that are involved with those houses.
So
This is a painting of one of these houses, the house, Albert's house, that's shown up there. And it was done by Joy Bubba. She was from a wealthy family that had a big estate out in Lloyd Neck. She became a fairly famous sculptor. But when she visited her parents in the 40s and 50s, out on Lloyd Neck, she would travel around and she painted a number of pictures of historic structures. And then at some point, she donated all of those canvases to the Huntington Historical Society. So we have a tremendous collection. In fact, if you've been to our decorative arts and museum at the Soldiers and Sailors building, there was recently, it's no longer up, but it was recently an exhibit of Joy Bubba's paintings, including this one.
Just by way of, I guess, architectural history, if nothing else, and to explain the history of the houses that we just saw, the ornate houses across the street. On the left is a traditional 5-bay Federal Center Hall colonial. This is actually the Rufus Prime house on Park Avenue, just shown as an example. And then a typical Long Island half house would be the Walt Whitman birthplace, built in 1818. So you can see it's got the 3 bays with a side hall entrance and then the service wing off to the side. And
so when we look at the transition that these houses made, we're luckily the current owners at on the John Daves Lane house, the Silas Sammis house, is an artist himself, and he had clipped from the New Yorker magazine a cartoon by Charles Adams, who of course is responsible for the Addams Family story, and shows the transitions in a cartoon fashion. And you can see on the left from A, which was a salt box kind of house, transitioned into a more Victorian, elaborate house during that period. And then when they came out of fashion, back into more of a 5-bay colonial house, back to its original house. And that's exactly the transitions that we feel the house at 391 made, the one on the right, which is the house at the corner of Camel Hollow Road. We feel it originally started by looking at the original basement as a Long Island half house. It then changed into this elaborate Victorian structure in the 1870s. And then in the 1920s, these houses had problems of upkeep, and the mansard roofs had a tendency to leak. The towers had tendency to leak, and so when that house was built, was bought, after the last Sammis died in the 1920s, he had a local architect design him a typical 5-bay federal house, and that's what it looks like today. The house at 405, we felt started, we don't have a picture of its original house, original looking, but it started as a 5-bay because its foundation was a bit larger. Then it transitioned into this elaborate Italianate Victorian house, again around 1870, but it stayed that way. So we have an example of those three houses now. Look as it did originally, look as its second transition into the Victorian, and looked at it as well as a third transition back into the federal. This is a picture of the house at the corner of Camel Hollow Road at 391, and it was quite an elaborate house, as you can see. It was on our house tour this past December, but looking as it does today as the 5-bay colonial. Now you can see what happens here is that Jesse Fleet, the original builder of the original house, son William Woodhull Sammis, Jesse Fleet Sammis' son was William Woodhull Sammis. He's the one that we feel when he got married in 1870 into the Bayless family, another local family, he's the one that had rebuilt the house, in our feeling. He dies in 1923 when it's sold to Colonel Timothy Williams, and he's the one who transitioned it back into the way it looks today. And the architect was Henry Saylor, who was a local architect here in Huntington at the time. You can see from that map where Colonel Williams' house, which still stands at the end of Camel Hollow Road, basically Camel Hollow Road was the entrance to his house, was the driveway, but he didn't own all that land until he built the Sammis house on the corner. But he didn't, he didn't like the look of that, so he remade it into this house as it looks today.
And without those photographs of what it looked like in the 19th century, we probably never would have known it went through that iteration. We said, oh, it was a traditional 5-bay center hall colonial, which would have made sense.
In fact, when I first found the photograph of the Victorian house and they said it was at the corner of Camel Hollow Road, I said, no, it's not. It's got to be one of the other houses. But in fact, it was. We didn't realize the transition. So this is the Lewis Sammis house. Again, he marries a Brush. His son was Warren Brush Sammis. And we believe that when he owned a tremendous amount of property on both sides of West Neck Road, Warren built a house that we're going to see a little bit later across the street from this house. But when his father died in 1876, we feel that he and his wife Rosalie moved into this house and rebuilt this house the way it looks today, and it still looks today. He has an unmarried sister who was probably living with the father, Lewis, when he died. She moves into the house Warren had built across the street. These are some pictures of the interior of that at 405 that indicate the earlier house which had been built over. There were indications that this formed from stairways that we found, the rubble foundation, beams that were in the basement and so forth, and this 12/8 double hung window. You want to deal with this one?
Not really. But
all right. Okay, go ahead. It's all yours.
Warren Brush Sammis that Toby just talked about in connection with 405 had lived at 412 across the street, which is a smaller and less ornate house. So that's when he decided to move across the street and Victorianize that house, and his sister Amanda moved into 412. What else are we trying to
Okay, so William Woodhull, whose father was Jesse Fleet Sammis, had a half brother because his mother died in childbirth when William was born. His half brother, his father Jesse Fleet Sammis, remarried a Brush, and they had a son, Henry Fleet Sammis. Henry Fleet was given land across the street from the house he grew up in, and a little bit north of the salt box where Epineus lived at 392, and he built in 398. Now he got married. Henry Fleet got married in Henry Fleet Sammis in 1863 to Henrietta Wood, and it's in. This was an interesting connection that we've made, and we'll follow through on a bit. But Henrietta Wood comes from, her father was Edwin Wood, and in her obituary, they talked about that the first year they were married, this is Henry Fleet Sammis and Henrietta, they lived with Henrietta's father, who would have been Edwin, while their house was being built. Well, if Henrietta was living with her father and her father was a house builder, the house we felt that Henry Fleet Sammis was building would have been built by Edwin, which is the house across the street. So of all these Victorian houses, and there's one more we have to go and talk about, we believe this is the first one that was built there. And you can see the tremendous similarity between the two houses on the left, which were built by his father and his uncle, and this house. And then Robert's going to talk about the other one, because Albert also had a daughter, Angeline Sammis, who married Charles Homer Davis, and he built a house that still stands across from the police booth, that also has a tower and looks very similar. And he built that around, he was a builder, Charles Homer Davis was a builder in New York. He came back to Long Island where he had grown up and where his wife had grown up, and they built this house, we believe, in the late 1860s.
So you have four very Victorianized, high-style Italianate houses, and since this only one of them exists, two of them, I guess, exist in the same style, or one and a half exist in the same style.
No, three of them still stand in this style.
Same style.
Yeah.
Well, but there've been changes.
There have been changes. Yeah.
If you look at the old pictures, it's easy to confuse these houses because towers have disappeared and houses have been completely remodeled. And so bear with us if it gets confusing. So this is the house built by Charles Homer Davis, who married Angeline Sammis. It's in the sort of the backyard and just south of the house that Angelina grew up in, which was the Albert Sammis house, the non-Italianate house in this collection. And it had a garage that was similar to the house with the mansard.
I think they called it a carriage house in those days.
Carriage house, right. Right. That would have been a carriage house. And a windmill, and then the house with the tower. And this is what it looks like in the 1870s. And this is what it looks like today. And you can see the tower is missing. And if you wanted to own a piece of Sammisville, it's on the market for $2.795. So it's a bargain at that price. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. And I don't think we've been in it yet, but I'm sure it's in tremendous condition. But you can see this one, other than the loss of the tower, remained in that original Italianate style. This is what we covered a little bit before. This was the house at 412 West Neck Road, built by Warren Brush Sammis on land owned by his father. And then when Warren Brush moved across the street and Italianized the house at 405, his unmarried sister undoubtedly moved in here.
Well, she definitely is attributed to living in that house, and her nephew Russell, who became a fairly good, fairly important real estate agent in the town, also lived there. In fact, in his obituary, Russell F. Sammis was born in this house in 1876, which verifies the fact that Warren Brush Sammis lived there because he was his son. But Warren Brush ended up moving and changing the house of her father. That's when Lewis had died in 1876.
Now, this is the Henry Fleet Sammis house. It's 398. And as I said, it's easy to confuse all these houses together. This is the one that was on the house tour in December on the corner of, it's up Seven Springs Road, which was developed as part of, when this property was subdivided, that road was developed. But this is the original driveway straight up into the house. And again, the tower is now gone, but the rest of the house looks pretty much the same.
Well, the middle part, the middle bay and that looks somewhat, that's gone too. Now it's a straight, you'll see a picture of it.
And this was built as a two-family house.
Yeah, this is the house as it looks today. So the tower is gone. The current owners, it was just a flat roof. There had been a fire in the tower, and the current owners decided to match the symmetry of the wing on the right-hand side by building a mansard roof over the corresponding wing on the left-hand side. And they also rebuilt the porch, so they took out that center tower or Victorian Italianate kind of architectural detail in the middle bay in the main block.
So this is built by Henry Fleet Sammis. This has two-family home. It's probably for him and his father, who had left the house across the street when William Woodhull Sammis took that house over. And it remained a two-family house until about 1930, when a subsequent owner converted it to a single-family house. But they still have two kitchens, the regular kitchen and the summer kitchen.
And you can see that's that marriage between Julia Loper Davis and Edwin Sammis. They would have been second cousins by that time, or in this chart. And then Edwin's sisters, May Sammis, married Reverend Samuel Seam, who was the minister at the Second Presbyterian Church in Huntington, and they lived in the manse. Well, they had their wedding at the church in 1904, and they lived at the manse, which would have been just east of that original church building. This is the second building for the Second Presbyterian Church, which is now called Central Presbyterian. And this building is gone and been replaced by a third building. But next to it would have been the manse, and that's where the Seams would have lived until he retired as minister in 1923, and he and Edith moved back to the old homestead. And that's written in articles that are written in the Long Islander. So it remained a two-family house. The need for the two-family house stayed. And this kind of like is a recap of what we just talked about, I guess, showing the four Victorian Italianate houses that were built and all owned by the Sammis family at different times. Three of them still maintain a lot of their appearance. These, though they've been changed, the tower is lost on 381 and also at 398. And of course, 391 has been totally changed. But 405 maintains its Victorian look and its original, or the second iteration of that building.
And it's difficult to say which is the inspiration. Was it the Charles Homer Davis house that inspired the other two Sammises to Victorianize their houses, or was it the Jesse Fleet Sammis house, which was actually built earlier the one that inspired everybody to build in the same style. Of course, it was a popular style at the time, and you see in other areas of town where older houses were transformed into the Italianate style.
And Charles Homer Davis was a builder of houses in New York City during this period of time, and he was building similar houses in New York. So who knows? We feel the first house built was Henry Fleet Sammis's house, but it could have been influenced by his brother-in-law, cousin-in-law, I don't know, whatever the relationship is between them, as a builder of these kind of houses in New York.
Now we're going to go back, and this is the 1873 map. A lot of those same houses we saw in 1858. The Alexander Sammis house is now Crossman, as we mentioned. But what we noticed was we've identified all these houses and they still exist, except we saw this E. Sammis down here by Mill Lane. And we were running, who is E. Sammis? And after some sleuthing and thinking about it, we realized it's got to be Edgar Sammis.
Yeah. Edgar Sammis had inherited the Richard Sammis house, which is the R. Sammis house. But since his father, he married before his father died, he would have, we feel, I think it's the next slide that shows this, that he would have had to, see, Edgar Sammis, his father lived till he was Richard Sammis II, lived to 1879. Edgar got married in 1854. So he would have needed a place to stay. And so the feeling was, oh, he built that house across the street from his father's house. And then when his father died, he moves back into that house. And it turns out he had a sister, Julia, who married a Sammis from the Alexander Sammis branch, George Augustus Sammis. And in this 1909 atlas, we saw the Julia Sammis there and realized that George had died in 1908. And so he was no longer the owner. Julia may have always been the owner, by the way. So that's where it was listed. We also saw Julia L. Sammis owning property there on, which is now Huntington, no, what's that road?
Middle Hollow Road.
Middle Hollow Road. And at first, when we looked at it, we thought they were the same people. But in fact, Julia Loper Davis would have been the daughter of Charles Homer. She was born a Davis. And then she became a Sammis when she married her second cousin, Edwin Sammis. So there are a whole bunch of things that sometimes you draw conclusions and then you have to come back and get and change your story because you realize different things.
And that Richard Sammis that we saw in the 1873 map is now Theodore Sammis, his grandson, because his father Edgar owned it in between.
Right.
It doesn't show up on any maps. So it's going to skip a generation because of the long gap between the two different maps. And a lot of these maps, they're available at the Historical Society in the archives. And there's also an exhibit that we'll talk about a little later centering on these maps. I don't know if we want to take some time to talk about the other people on the map here or.
Oh, okay, Roland. Yeah, okay, yeah. To identify everybody with that may not be all that familiar, or maybe familiar somewhat with West Neck and Lloyd Harbor. The Roland Conklin property, of course, is the seminary property now. The Dr. Oliver Jones Brickyards.
The Roland Conklin again is an example of somebody making his fortune and coming back to town where his ancestors had lived. The Conklins didn't necessarily own this property, but he bought land in town again. And then Dr. Oliver Jones.
Yeah. He bought it from the Crossmans. Roland Conklin bought it from the Crossman family, who owned it at the time. But you're right. Roland Conklin made his money in Chicago, basically, set up an office in New York City and decided he wanted a summer home on the North Shore of Long Island. So he built Rosemary Farm with an amphitheater, but that's a whole nother story.
And that is now the seminary.
And that's not a seminary.
Catholic seminary. And then you have Dr. Oliver Jones purchased the old Crossman Brickyards.
The Van Schoik family descended into a daughter of his married to Kelly. And so he's up there. That's where the Camerlin property was. You can see the Van Wyck properties down off West Neck Road. That was a 500-acre farm that was divided into 4 different properties, all owned by the Van Wyck family. I'm sorry, off Southdown, yeah. There's Walter Jennings estate, which was Burwood, that no longer exists, but there's some of the outbuildings still there. You can see the Colonel T.S. Williams, which is at the end of Camel Hollow Road, and they're the ones that bought the W.W. Sammis building house, which is down there at West Neck on this one, not WB, WW.
Oh, I'm
That's
sorry.
it. Yeah, right. And that's the house that's at the corner of Camel Hollow Road. And then the Bustanavi brothers bought briefly the Paulding farm, but then it was sold to the Milbank family. And that's where, at the end of Quail Hill Road, where Panfield is, the estate of Albert Milbank.
And the Bustanavi brothers moved to
That's true.
Bay and built the Chateau Beaux-Arts, which is now where the Bay Club is.
Right.
Again, that's another story.
That's another story.
So getting back to Edgar.
Yes, getting back to Edgar. This was a house that we found in our archives, and it was labeled on the back West Neck, possibly Rankin or Fisk. As we found that some of the labeling on the photographs have been mislabeled in the past, you have to take it a little bit with a grain of salt. But when we looked at the maps, we find the Rankin on this 1931 atlas at the corner of Mill Road and West Neck, which is, of course, where the police booth is today. Now, there's no historic house there, but we know at one point there was this Edgar Sammis house existed, and we believe this was the house that was on the property where the police booth is. So this would have also been a Sammis house, but from the very early 1858 map that we started with, where we found 9 of the 10 houses listed as Sammis houses still existing, well, this was the one that was missing.
And you can see on this 1931 map that Mill Lane used to be called Swamp Road.
It was called Mill Lane historically. For some reason, it was changed to Swamp Road, but I guess nobody wants to live on Swamp Road, so they changed it back to Mill Lane. Now, why did we put this one on? Oh, I guess this is to show again some of those properties that exist, the Milbank and Anderson properties. Elizabeth Anderson was the great aunt, I think, of Albert Milbank. Milbank is a very famous law firm in New York City that still exists, and there's still a Milbank Trust Fund. He's the one who built Panfield, and you can see that building built in this 1917. You see the Kelly properties again. The George McKesson Brown, which is Quandra Hall, is built by 1917, and that's there. Mary E. Jones has bought the Brickyards. She's the daughter. She's the daughter of Oliver Jones, right?
Widow.
She's the daughter of Oliver Jones.
Widow. She's the widow of Oliver.
The widow of Jones. I'm sorry. And she inherited that at that point. And you see the Francis Weld up there. That's the owners that built a bigger house down toward the harbor. But if you look up at the West Neck Road, at the corner of West Neck Road, you see the outline of the Alexander Sammis house right there.
No, it's Toby's favorite story. Second favorite story.
Well, this is a story we didn't have in the original talk because we didn't know it. But in searching something else, as always happens, I came up with this story of on 1882, of a sleigh ride that 6 couples had taken after a snowstorm in early February. And I just read it and noticed who was on it. It was Warren B. Sammis. And I said, I know who he is. W. Woodhull Sammis, I know who he is. Henry F. Sammis, I know who he is. Thomas Atkin was a merchant in town, lived on Main Street. So I kind of knew who he was. Dr. William Wooden, William D. Wooden, right, who was the doctor in town. I knew who he was, and I knew he had built a house on Main Street across from Prospect Road. It's obviously been torn down now, but it was across from where the St. John's Episcopal Church is. And then George C. Hendrickson, I think I had to look up, but he was the local justice of the peace. So I began investigating who they all were. And when I discovered that Edwin Wood, and you can see down there on the chart, was the father of Henrietta Wood, who I had that by now discovered felt he built the Henry Fleet Sammis, but he's listed as building the William Wooden house on Main Street. And so I realized that William Wooden, Dr. William Wooden had married Iantha Wood, who was the sister and therefore the daughter of Edwin Wood. And so that makes sense. And then George Hendrickson had married the youngest daughter of Edwin Wood. And so that begins to tie them together. And then, of course, I knew the relationship, which I show over there, between Henry Fleet Sammis, William Woodhull Sammis, who were half brothers, and their first cousin was Warren Brush Sammis. And they, of course, knew the houses that they all lived in. So it made some sense. And this was a day trip. And it goes from, they were visiting the St. John's Institute, which was started in 1866, I believe, which still exists today as a nursing home. And more than that now, they've enlarged it tremendously on St. John's Road. And then they drove to the farm of Edward Henry Smith, who was the former member of Congress of the district. And they obviously must have known him or had some relationship with him. And it says they had a very pleasant trip going over by way of Northport and Vernon Valley, which would have been essentially along 25A till they got to St. John's Road. And then they would have followed St. John's Road and it turns south. And then it hooks up to 25A as it goes all the way south to the head of the Nisquag River, which is by the Bull today. And that's where Edward Henry Smith lived. And then they returned by way of Comac, which would have been along Jericho Turnpike, probably to Park Avenue back into Huntington. And they must have left fairly early in the morning, got back fairly late. But in February, it's the days are getting longer. And so they had a little bit more daylight, but they all made it in a day. It must have been quite a trip. We have a picture of a sleigh that's in the Huntington Historical Society collection. That would have been, there would have been 3 sleighs. It talks about 3 sleighs that would have carried 2 couples each. And that's what this sleigh would have carried. So there would have been 3 sleighs very similar to this. We have yet to look up who actually gave us that sleigh. And who knows, it may have been one of the sleighs that made that trip. This is a sketch of Dr. William Wooden Wood. That's the house, is the house on the first house on the left. Of course, he married Iantha Wood, was built by her father, Edwin Wood. The house below, no, the house diagonally, the Henry Fleet house was also built by Edwin Wood for his daughter. And then, of course, the other 2 houses that we've seen on this tour. And I think we have one more. No, we have 2 more.
Now it's your favorite story.
Now it's my favorite story. When I did the talk on early Huntington baseball, I had found this article about the West Neck team, and it listed the players on the West Neck team. And I noticed there were 5 Sammis people on it. Well, it turns out that 2 of them there were 2 sets of brothers, and they were all first cousins to each other. And they lived in these 2 Victorian houses at the time. Now the last slide.
And the family connection continues. These were all
Yes.
Sammis houses, and now they're all Callahan houses.
It turns out that the current owner of the Elbert House, one of the sons of Epineus that was built on the west side, he has bought that house, but two of his adult children decided they wanted to live near their fathers, and so their son has bought the Richard Sammis house there at the opposite the police booth, and their daughter and her husband has built the house at 412, which would have been the Warren.
Bought the house.
I'm sorry, what?
Bought the house. I think you said
Bought the
built.
house, yeah, bought the house at 412. And so now we have another story. Now, neither of these houses have been on our house tours yet, but I have met Lauren and Daniel Callahan, and we hope to meet up with the other Callahans. And so now we may be called Callahanville.
So that's the Sammisville. We're certainly open for answering questions, but we want to let you know what the Historical Society has going on. There's the Soldiers and Sailors building in the Decorative Arts and Huntington History Museum, an exhibit on the founding mothers in celebration of the Society's 120th anniversary.
Which would have included Sammis's.
Yes. And the most recent exhibit to open is down at the Half Hollow Hills Library on Vanderbilt Parkway. It's maps of Long Island and Huntington. It's a very interesting exhibit. Some very old maps, very attractive maps, and there's a needlepoint map that I really enjoyed. That's very neat down there. So these are some articles written in Newsday about those two exhibits. The map exhibit will be up for, I guess,
Through
Till the
March.
end of March, right?
and Founding Mothers is going to be more or less up all year. There's also a new exhibit coming to the Soldiers and Sailors building on the legal history of Huntington. It will probably open later this month or March.
Yeah, early March on that one.
Yes. So if there are any other questions, I think we've answered the questions that came up while we were talking. Happy to answer other questions as well.
You could, if you can unmute yourself if you have questions.
No questions?
I see comments of fantastic presentation from Catherine Smith.
I just wanted to thank you for the house tour. First of all, I went to the house tour in December. It was fascinating and got into some houses that I've always wanted to go to. So, and then this is kind of just more of the backstory. So that's great. And Robert has provided me with some information. I live on Mechanic Street, so my house was owned by one of the Sammises at some point in time, and then the house next door, 116 West Neck, was, I believe, one of the Conklins at the time. So it's they've traveled, I guess, south down in my direction. The Sammises.
Oh,
at some point in time. They're everywhere.
Sammises were all over. I mean,
Yeah.
It's interesting that you talk to the Sammis family of Smithtown, of Centerport, and they think they're their own family. And we're not related to the Huntington Sammises. Well, they are.
They
And
are,
the Northport Sammis
ultimately, yes.
feel the same thing.
Yeah.
It's a huge family, and probably the family that has stayed in Huntington more than any other the original families in numbers anyway.
Yes.
And they're all over town.
In
And
the
it's-
what?
They're all over town, every corner.
And
of
they're
town.
all over town.
Yeah,
yeah.
yes.
And
it's
have been
also-
for centuries.
It's also nice to see that some people on Mechanic have, a little plaque to say who was the original owner of the house, like, because Rebecca Sammis owns that one. I own the one that was on West Neck that's pushed in the back. So it's really nice. It's a lot of interesting history.
Yes.
That's why that's why I asked about the maps. I'd really like to get my hands on a map that I could frame for my house.
Well, you may be able to do that, but you should go down to the Half Hollow Hills Library.
I
and
will.
Because we have a number of atlas maps as well
Okay.
of the area, and you're going to find lots of Sammises on those maps. The ones that we used in this talk too.
Is the archives open again, or is it by
Yes.
appointment? It is.
Yes.
Okay.
Janet, yeah, it's best to make an appointment because
Okay.
with Karen, she may have someone else in there or doing some other work, but
Okay.
happy to have people make appointments and come and do some research.
Okay.
It's
Yeah.
there
Because
5 days a week now, so it's a little
Okay.
more flexible.
Because my house, from what I understand and looking at the site history on the Huntington website, apparently my open porch, which I love, was originally a closed porch. And then my 1-car garage apparently was originally a barn that was knocked down and built into a garage in the 70s. So I was hoping to maybe find some old pictures of the house in its original state.
Yeah,
Well,
that
I would recommend, they have a lot of
miss.
pictures and
it really depends if someone had donated, a picture of the
Yes.
house over the years.
Yeah.
We have a lot more pictures, photographs of downtown businesses and stores,
Yeah.
but not necessarily houses.
Yeah.
But it's worth a call to Karen and ask, that's something it'd be better to call ahead of time.
Yeah.
and,
Okay.
Which she has.
Okay. Thanks.
well, I want to, thank Robert and Toby for reprising this wonderful presentation because I think it would be wonderful to have it for us to put on YouTube and for people to be able to see who weren't able to make it today. Thank you everyone for participating in the virtual Lunch and Learn, and also, of course, to our sponsors of all of our Lunch and Learn programs, M&T Bank. Without their support, it would be hard to do all these programs. So please visit our website for other upcoming events and Lunch and Learns, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you again, Toby and Robert.
You're welcome. Thank you all.
Yes, you're very welcome.